In this demo video, we're going to show you how to make a small open-faced mold so that we can make multiple identical copies to practice our principle of art and design, which is repetition and rhythm. We start out with having a small form, in this case a seashell. We're looking for anything that we can press into plaster and clay, so something that washes off easily with soap and water. Items that don't have undercuts in them. Undercuts are areas in which the mold material, the plaster, would lock in on the original piece and not want to let it go. So if we don't have undercuts, we're going to have a really smooth sailing time. If we don't, then a little unhappiness when we're trying to get the original out of the mold. So think of things with simple curves as opposed to compound curves or things that might cut back underneath. So say you're doing a small bobblehead or something, and the ear, you don't want to go beyond the other side of the ear, so that when the plaster pours over top of it, it won't grab the back of the ear and not let go. We need clay, we need original objects, we need water, we need plaster, we need some type of a release medium. Obviously we're all working at home right now, and we may not have petroleum jelly or Vaseline or Murphy's oil soap, but dish soap will work, or even hand soap. You just need something to give a temporary seal to your object so that it will release from the plaster. Okay. First we start with a small mound of clay, just slightly bigger than your form. Then what we can do with this, we can press what we're going to make a copy of into the clay. I'm going to make sure that that part of the clay that meets up just up against that shell is smooth, there's no gaps, so that when the plaster comes in, it'll leave a nice, crisp, clean edge. Okay. Simple as that. If I turn it around, and the lumpy part of the shell in the back, I made sure to cover up enough to where the undercut is covered and buried in clay, so we don't have to worry about that little haphazard thing going on later. Once we have our original object buried in clay, at least to half of its thickness, we need to build up some type of a wall to hold our plaster in when we mix it and pour it in. Doesn't have to be pretty, but just make sure that you come up at least 1 inch above the top of your form. That way when we start to use the press mold to press clay into, and we press into it with a little bit of force, we're not going to crack the mold. Okay, about half of that one down there. Coming around to the front. Make sure we're getting up to at least 1 inch above where our form is. It doesn't have to be gigantic, just enough, again, to leave the mold sturdy. I'm smoothing out where the wall meets the base, just so the plaster doesn't slip in beyond there. Okay. Almost there. Okay. So it was that quick. Now we come in with our release agent. I'm going to use the Murphy's oil soap. It's thin, it's liquidy, but it provides good coverage for most items. Brush it on. You don't need to put it on the clay because the clay has water in it and it will resist the plaster. So the clay will always let go. It's your object that you're making a copy of that you need to coat with some type of a resist, either the oil soap, the Vaseline, or any type of dish soap would work out well. You want to coat it, but you don't want it super thick to where you lose all of your detail. So I'm going to take a little bit off. Okay, we got that going. Now we're going to move on to our plaster. For the plaster, I have a small container of water, and I have just a big scoop of plaster here. The mix is 7 parts water to 10 parts plaster, so you don't really need a whole lot of water. And when you're doing this, you don't necessarily have to wear gloves, but it will dry out your hands. And if you do it often enough, your hands start to crack, and then it's an unpleasant feeling. So it's not detrimental to your health if you don't wear gloves and for 1 or 2 mixings, but if you do it repeatedly, it's going to dry your hands out. So gloves are a good idea if you have them. So like I said, 7 parts water to 10 parts plaster. We take a small amount of plaster and we start dropping it into the water. Slowly let it sink to the bottom. We're just trying to avoid getting any lumps in here. Okay, almost there. If you have a sifter, sometimes you do that. If you're doing this more on an industrial level, you would actually weigh out your water and you would weigh out your plaster to get the appropriate ratios every single time to make sure you have the same strength all the time. But we're just doing this at home, so we use the island technique. So we keep adding plaster to this water until we see islands across the whole surface of that water for at least 10 seconds. The islands are the plaster that sits on top that has not sunk down to the bottom yet. So we're just going to keep going. You're starting to see a few islands up there, but they're not staying for 10 seconds, so we keep adding. There we go. See, it's starting to sit on top a little bit longer. Almost there. Almost there. Okay, it's still sinking. Okay. It's harder in smaller containers. If you have a bigger container and you're making a bigger mix, it's easier to get in there, but I'm not used to the coffee creamer container, but we're all having to make do in this time, but we can still make our... Okay. Now I can stop. So now you can see that the plaster is sitting on top. And the islands are peaks for at least 10 seconds. Then we know we probably have about enough plaster, put a little bit more around that edge. There. They're staying up all around on top. So then we can come in with our gloved hand, give that a mix. It should still feel a little bit thick, kind of like pancake batter. You just want to mix it up, get rid of all of the lumps that might be in there. Because get that water incorporated into the plaster and the plaster into the water. Get all the lumps out so that we have a good liquidy fluid, so that when we pour it on top of our object, we get all that detail that we're actually wanting from it. Okay, so that's actually pretty well mixed, and you can see it runs off but then starts to clump off, and your gloves or your fingers are completely coated in that white plaster. That's what we're looking for. So we can pour this on top, fill it up to the top. There we go. Then you gotta let it set for probably about 20 to 30 minutes. You'll know when it's done because it has this nice shiny watery surface on the top right now. Well, not really watery, but it's nice and shiny and glossy. That will then become a matte. As it goes from glossy to matte, it starts to heat up, and there's a heat exchange in the chemical process for plaster to start setting. And in that process it gets hot up to about 120 degrees, and it starts to cool back down again. So when it's cooler to the touch and you can put your fingernail on top of it and it's not digging in, then you know it's ready. But to skip forward ahead, this is roughly about what we would end up with. Our plaster's on the top, our shell is in the bottom, and then we've got the clay on the bottom. You flip everything over, you can take your original out of the mold, you can come in with a ball of clay, press into your press mold, and then you start to peel that back out. And then you have a copy of your shell. The idea is that it would take me probably about 20 minutes to make this one on its own if I did not have a way of rapidly repeating, duplicating, or repetition to make quick copies. In the next video, I'll show you the rest of this progress to go from repetition, which is getting the same item, to getting rhythm, where we build up visual repetitions of different items to create a visual movement across our form. Okay, catch me in the next video.